So, hi there, Felicity. Thank you for agreeing to doing this tutorial. So I'm going to ask you a few questions about your career, how you got there, what you've been doing. And for everyone that's listening, we're going to be pausing every now and again, and I'm going to be asking you various questions. So, Felicity, could you tell me a bit about what you do?
Well, in a very sort of simple form, I am a barrister. I'm a Queen's Counsel, so a QC, otherwise called a silk, after the fact that I wear a nice gown made of silk when I'm in court. And my job is to be an advocate. So I am there as the speaker in court, and I'm the person who is the mouthpiece of the client. So I actually have two clients. One of my clients is my professional client, who's a solicitor, and the other is my lay client, who's the underlying client, the person whose business it actually is. So as a barrister, my primary role is as an advocate, but I also give advice. So some of the time I'm in court as an advocate, and some of the time I'm predicting what a court might do. So somebody comes to me and says, here, I have a problem. What do you think would happen if it goes to court? Sometimes I'm dealing with it at a stage even before that. So how would you draft a piece of, write something so that when a court looked at it, what do you think the court would think about it? So like all barristers, my work is therefore divided between advisory work, which is the written work, and court work, which is when I'm actually in court doing the advocacy.
And when you're doing the advisory work, kind of how long would that take before maybe you go to court?
Sometimes I don't go to court at all. So the aim in quite a lot of what I do is so that my clients will never have to go to court. So for pure advisory work, I'm looking at drafting something, I'm looking at writing something in a way that nobody will ever have to go to court to work out what it means. And even in a work which is to do with court work, I'm trying to make sure that it doesn't go to court. So how can I put my client's case in writing in the best possible way? So every letter that goes from my solicitor to the solicitors on the other side, I will be using written advocacy rather than oral advocacy. So rather than saying stuff, I will be writing it down. And then I will be saying, this is the best way to put across your case. And what you really want is for the other side to look at it and think, oh God, I don't want to go to court against this. I'm just going to give in. And so the aim of 99% of the work I do is to avoid going to court, because going to court is expensive and unpredictable.
So it's obviously the most preferable outcome to try and resolve things amicably without having to go down the court route.
Yeah, and one of the things I actually do, I'm also a qualified mediator and a qualified arbitrator. So arbitration is when you deal with things not in front of a formal court, but in front of arbitrators. So instead of being judges, they are usually professionals. So, for example, if you went in front of an aviation arbitrator, there would be a lawyer, but there would also be some people who work in the airline industry. So I sit as an arbitrator, so as a sort of quasi-judge, or as a mediator. My aim is to get people together and get them to a solution which makes them both happy, but doesn't require them to go to court at all. So whether I'm sitting as an arbitrator or a mediator, or whether I'm acting as counsel, my job is to keep cases away from court.
So what inspired you to go into law?
I quite like talking. So I always like public speaking, and I really like problem solving. So I like it when people come to me and say, here's something that's very, very difficult. I don't really know what to do about it. And I say, oh, you should do this. And it requires you to have quite a strong sense of being able to, I was going to say bullshit, but let's not say, find an answer which sounds convincing to people. I also liked acting. A lot of barristers are frustrated actors. So if you like public speaking and you like acting, that tends to make you want to go into the barrister route. And if you like solving problems, then you probably want to be a lawyer.
So what training did you do? And maybe you could tell me a little bit about the education And then also whether you had to do any work experience, so when you were at school and university.
So there are two routes to becoming a lawyer. So let's just talk about lawyers generally, and then I'll divide them into barristers and solicitors. One route is to do a law degree. If you do a law degree, then you have done everything that you need to do. There are core subjects that you have to cover. If you don't do a law degree, if you do a degree in any other subject, then you will need to do what's called a law conversion course, which is either a 1 year or a 2-year course, which obviously costs more money. And you then have to do the core subjects in that time, which means you have to do them very quickly, and you have to pay for another level of education. I couldn't afford to do that. I couldn't afford to do more than one degree, even though when I went to university it was free. But I couldn't afford to pay for a law conversion course. I had to get into work and start earning some money. So I did a law degree. I then did a master's because, as it happened, that was also free. So I did an undergraduate degree in law, a master's degree in law. And then once you've done that basic training, you get to choose either to become a barrister or a solicitor. If you become a barrister, you go to bar school for 1 year. If you want to become a solicitor, you go to law school for 2 years. And at bar school, you learn things like advocacy and negotiation and conference skills. And at law school, you have to learn things like accounts, which I couldn't face doing because that seemed to me far too boring. Although, strangely, I ended up in an area of the law where I have to look at accounts all the time. And in both levels, you have to do ethics, the sort of ethics that you need to have to be a barrister or a solicitor, which are slightly different because you're doing different jobs.
Could you tell us a little bit more about the difference in the ethics?
Well, it's a difficult question to answer. The difference between barristers and solicitors, broadly speaking, is who their clients are. So if you're a solicitor, your client is your lay client. If you're a barrister, your clients are, as I said, your professional client, so your solicitor, and your lay client. Ultimately, your solicitor pays you. So they have to get the money from the lay client and then they pay you. And if the lay client doesn't pay the solicitor, that's tough. The solicitor still has to pay you. So there are all sorts of rules for solicitors about what they have to do when the lay client gives them money. Barristers don't have any of those rules because what happens when someone gives us money is we say thank you very much and we put it in our bank accounts. So we have no ethics relating to solicitors' account rules because we're never dealing with someone else's money. We're only ever dealing with our own money. So that is the biggest difference between the ethics between the two of you. Both barristers and solicitors are officers of the court, which means that you owe an obligation to tell the truth. Mm-hmm. Barristers have that even larger because if I'm appearing in front of a judge, everything I say to the judge must be true, which also means not saying things which I don't know whether they're true or not, and not saying things which I know to be false because I've seen something in the papers which says it's false, even if the other side hasn't picked it up. But I can say to the judge, this is my client's case on something, even if I think actually it's probably not the right answer, because my job is to say, to win the case for my client, but consistently with telling the truth. So my obligations are all around what I say to the court. There are also things like, if I'm about to go to court and my client says to me, by the way, something I've told you is a lie, what I have to do in that case. So I can't continue to go to court on the basis of a lie. So I have to consider, do I tell the court this? Or do I say to the court, I'm sorry, I can't come and talk to you at all anymore. So we're called professionally embarrassed, which is a lovely way of saying, if I turned up, I'd have to lie to you. But we can't do that in such a way as to tell the court that there's a lie, because we still owe obligations to our client. So there are all sorts of ethics around what you say without screwing up your client, but also not lying to the court. And there are even more of those obligations for criminal barristers, because the big question people always ask criminal barristers is, how can you represent somebody you know to be guilty? And the answer to that is, I never ask my client whether they are guilty or not.
Fair enough.
If they tell you I'm guilty, you then cannot go to the court and say that they are not guilty.
Yeah.
So the ethics questions are very, very interesting and sometimes really difficult. So I've had cases where a client has said, I want you to go to the court and say something. And I've said, I cannot say that because that is not true. I've also had cases where I've said to the client, look, your case isn't very good because of you don't have any evidence of this. And they say, well, what if I did have evidence of that? And I say, well, that would be great. And they'd say, okay, we'll just go away and do that. And I said, no, you will not go take evidence. That would be a bad thing. Do not do that. Or people say to you things like, you say, well, any money that's in your name will be available to the other side. And I say, well, I'll just go put it all in my wife's name then. And you say, no, can't do that. That would be bad. So those ethical questions are quite entertaining, really.
So I think we may have slowly started touching on it, but I was wondering if you could tell me about what does taking a pupillage mean, and how does one prepare for something like that? And I think some of the people listening may not know about pupillage.
Right. So I was explaining the different routes to becoming a barrister and a solicitor. So imagine you've now got to this position where you're a barrister, you've done a law degree or a conversion course, you've done your 1 year of bar school. We'll put solicitors to one side for a moment because we're only dealing with the barrister route. Then the next thing you have to do is get a pupillage. Getting a pupillage is very difficult because it's a specific form of apprenticeship where you are taken into a set of chambers, and I'll explain what that is in a minute. And the people there are effectively saying, we're trying you out for about a year to work out whether you are somebody we want to have working with us. Now, barristers, unlike solicitors, are all self-employed. So if you were to join a solicitor's firm as a trainee solicitor, so you would have a training contract, which is a 2-year course, you would just be joining a law firm. And they would employ you and they would pay your salary. And at the end of it, they would decide whether they wanted to take you on as a qualified solicitor. For barristers, we are all self-employed people just happening to work together in the same building and using the same administration, same practice managers, same secretaries, same people doing the printing. And we pay money out of our own pockets to rent our rooms. So we have a rent obligation. Just like anybody, any other business working somewhere else, if you were a sole trader doing any other kind of business and you had to rent a room. So we pay to rent our rooms in the same building, and we pay a percentage of everything we own to pay for things like pupils. So when pupils come to be in chambers, I will have paid a proportion of their pupillage award, which is effectively their salary, which is quite a lot of money these days. I think it's something like £75,000 for my chambers. So pupils, when I started, were either paid nothing. I think I got £10,000 or £12,000 for my pupillage year. Now they are paid a lot of money. So we in chambers pay out of our pocket a certain percentage every year to have pupils come on, and then we train them. So they sit with different members of chambers, so different self-employed people give up their time. Used to be called pupil masters and pupil mistresses. These days we're called pupil supervisors. I don't do it anymore now, I'm a QC, but for 7 or 8 years, I had a pupil sit with me. And I would give them work to do. And sometimes that work would be useful to me. So I would say to them, can you just research this point of law? But sometimes I would just be giving them an exercise to do. And I would constantly be judging them, basically, for a year. And then they would go to the next person who would judge them as well. So it'd be like doing an exam. Usually it's between 9 months and a year. In fact, as of today, we've just taken on both of our pupils because we didn't want them to have to hang around anymore during the current situation. We didn't think it was fair. So we've just said to both of them, yes, we're keeping you on. They do advocacy exercises. So I sometimes sit as a judge. They have to present a case to me. I try and make it difficult for them to see how they react under pressure. And this apprenticeship is really this 9 to 12 month exam. And at the end of that time, something like 50% of them usually get told, no, I'm sorry, you didn't make the grade. Because we are looking for somebody who we will trust to take the name of our chambers.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so if somebody isn't good enough, we won't keep them, and they'll have to find somewhere else. So what can you do to prepare for it? Well, the first thing you have to do is you have to get the best possible degree you can. Doesn't matter what it's in, it doesn't matter where it's from, but it has to be the best possible degree you can get. Then you need to write a covering letter, which goes with your CV and says, I want to come to your chambers because, and my chambers is a company commercial set. So saying, I want to come to your chambers because I love criminal law means you will be thrown in the bin. Mm-hmm. But these days, most of this stuff, I think, comes through what's called the pupillage gateway. So you fill in a form and you tick the people you want to apply to. And then we go through every single application and we look at them, and then we make allowances for where people's backgrounds. Mm-hmm. So we have diversity criteria that we apply. And then we say to people, come along for an interview. And then we interview a relatively small percentage of those people who've applied. The only exception to that is we also, like a lot of chambers, run an assessed mini pupillage scheme. And I'll talk about mini pupillage in a minute, but the assessed scheme, or I think it's now called funded mini pupillage, because we pay 500 quid for a week, which is also not a bad outcome. People come along, they sit with more senior people, and they will also do a written problem for us. We don't expect them to know anything necessarily about law, but we're looking at their reasoning skills. Mm-hmm. So if you do that, you skip level 1 and you go straight to the second interview. Doesn't mean you'll necessarily get kept, but if you've done a good enough job, you'll jump the queue. Mm-hmm. But that in and of itself is its own separate application process. Mm. So mini pupillage is basically work experience. We don't, and it's called mini pupillage to differentiate it from pupillage. We generally don't have any mini pupils unless they're in their second year of a law degree, okay, or in their conversion course, because it's pretty useless for you to go along to a barrister's chambers when you're much more junior, because your aim is to try and impress people, and if you don't know anything about anything, it isn't necessarily any good for you. Some chambers do mini pupillages for people at school, and I occasionally do work experience for people, mm-hmm. Which I do sort of off the books, and that's usually 2 or 3 days where people just come in and spend some time with me. But my top tip for that is do not fall asleep in my room when you're doing a mini pupillage. That's generally not a good way to get taken on. So if it's in the middle of hay fever season, don't take all your antihistamines. I've had 2 people fall asleep in my room during mini pupillage, and it's not just because they were bored. That's not good. Don't talk during meetings if you're a mini pupil. Because you probably don't know anything. I mean, obviously, if somebody says, oh, what's your name and what do, you can say something, but generally don't interrupt a barrister while they're speaking in the mid with clients. Mm. But if you can do some form of work experience, it is a good way to get a feel for it. If you can't, go and sit in the back of a court. A bit more difficult these days on account of courts being shut. But when we're through the pandemic, go and sit in a court and see if it's something that looks interesting to you.
Could you? So we've covered barrister. How about a solicitor?
So solicitors have training contracts. So they have 2 years of training contracts. They spend 6 months, I think. I think it's 6 months in each seat. So they'll do usually a corporate seat. Depends on the sort of solicitors. If it's a smaller solicitor, then it won't be quite like this, but they'll do a corporate seat, a property seat, a litigation seat, and then usually they get to choose for their fourth seat. And the aim is to find the place where you want to qualify. So if you really want to do employment law, you'll try and do probably a litigation seat in employment and another employment seat. And your aim is to get taken on in a particular seat. The numbers of people who get kept on as trainees is much higher. In the big firms, you get paid a huge amount of money. I mean, 120 grand per year. And if you're a solicitor, you get paid a salary. If you're a barrister, you're self-employed. So if you don't work, you don't get paid anything. So at the moment, for some barristers, they're getting paid nothing at all. So if you can't work, that's a big problem for barristers.
So going back to you, so what made you pick your particular area? So I understand your specialism is in domestic and cross-border insolvency and restructuring, which is quite a mouthful.
It sounds really interesting, doesn't it? It really is. So at the moment, it's basically anything you hear of in the news is one of my cases. So if you hear about Flybe airline going down, that's one of my cases. So anyone who's going bust at the moment, which is basically everybody, it is a client of mine. So insolvency is just where someone's gone bust. Restructuring is where someone's got no money, but you're trying to make sure they don't quite go bust. How did I end up doing it? A complete and utter accident. I thought I wanted to do international and European employment law and human rights. I went and did that for about 6 months. It was incredibly boring. And I did some commercial law while I was at it. I then moved after 6 months to another chambers, and I had a choice between shipping and insurance at one set of chambers and insolvency at mine. And I thought that mine sounded slightly less boring than shipping and insurance. And then once I got there, I discovered that it's completely different from what you'd think, because just someone going bust, it could be a family dispute, it could be a husband and wife and the husband's got bankrupt. It could be a huge international fraud like Madoff, where people's money has just gone missing into all sorts of different jurisdictions, or you're trying to track down a yacht that's been bought with money that's been stolen. Or it could be a huge company like Swissport, for instance, which was the case I was doing on Friday, where Swissport are the people who run the refueling and all sorts of things to do with airlines. And so at the moment, they're not terribly busy and they need to borrow some more money. And in order to borrow some more money, they need to rewrite all their contracts. And there's a way you can do that in an insolvency context by, instead of agreeing with everybody with whom you've got contracts, you can just go to court and get a special sort of overlapping contract to deal with it. So it can be straight commercial, it can be fraud, it can be family law, it can be trusts. And the only thing that matters in any of these cases is someone somewhere is short of money. So as it happens, insolvency law ended up being really, really interesting. But mostly I chose it because it wasn't shipping and insurance, because I thought that sounded a bit too boring. Although probably if I'd done that, I would have discovered that was really interesting too.
You never know. So what do you do in your day-to-day then?
So at the moment, that's a bit of a difficult answer because the entire universe is collapsing. So let me give you an example of last week. So last week I was in court 3 days, Monday, Wednesday and Friday. Monday, I was in court with in private, which means nobody knows the name of the case. It was dealing with a high street retailer, which I can say because that part of it is public. And someone was trying to wind us up, even though the reason why we couldn't pay them the rent is because all the shops are shut at the moment. And there is new law. There is a 240-page new piece of legislation, new statute, which is coming into force probably at the end of the month. And so the people on the other side said, it's not law yet, we can put you into liquidation. And we said the court can take into account the fact that the law is coming. And the judge agreed. and said at the end of it, oh God, I wish this was public, because otherwise we're going to have 3 of these a week until the law comes in. And I said, well, why don't you just call it in rea company? Don't say anything special about my client and you can get it out there. Next morning, judgment was out there called in rea company. And since then, I've had probably 50 emails from people saying, you've just saved my client. So that is high street companies not going bust because a judge said, oh, I think, yeah, I mean, that all seems sensible to me. Let's just do something sensible about it. That was Monday. But that case had come in on Friday. So that involved my junior and me working all weekend on it in order to get huge pieces of evidence. And then I was in court almost all day on Monday. Then on, well, no, I was in court in the afternoon on Monday. So all of Monday morning was spent making sure the papers were in court at 8 o'clock, lining up the hearing at 9 o'clock, and then printing off 2,500 pages of paper so that I could then present it to the judge in the afternoon.
It's enormous.
So it was a huge case to deal with very, very, very fast. Tuesday, I was preparing for a case I had on Wednesday, which was a case that I had won on appeal. And the question was, what happened next? And the other side was saying, for various irrelevant reasons, that they didn't have to pay our costs. And we said, that's ridiculous. So I spent all of Tuesday looking at the cases, which explained why the other side was wrong, putting together the order I wanted the judge to make, making sure I had all of the documents in the right order. These ones I didn't print off. I had an electronic court bundle. And then Wednesday morning, I was in court on that. And again, we won on all the points we needed to win on there. And I then could leave my junior to sort that out. Wednesday afternoon, I was preparing for the case I had on Friday, because on Thursday, I was dealing with a £1 billion repo transaction, which is repo is short for repurchase, where you sell something and then buy it back in the same transaction. And the question was how you analyze that as a matter of contract. So I spent all day working on that and drafting a 70-page advice, which will be used to structure all these transactions. So this was £1 billion. There will be 7 or 8 of them. So it's 7 or 8 billion pounds worth of money resting on this. Friday, I was in court on the scheme of arrangement for Swissport. We had 40 or 50 people on there, but everything's being done remotely. So we had a huge number of journalists who were interested because it's such a huge international company. I was acting for people supporting it as opposed to the company presenting it, which meant I didn't have to do quite so much of the work. We were in court from 10:30 in the morning until 4 o'clock in the afternoon in order to get this scheme sorted. So that was a week with a mix of advisory and court, but quite a lot more court than usual. And I would say I probably had not more than about 4 hours sleep a night because I was up preparing for the next day, just again and again, different cases. And that is quite usual for barristers, that we have a dozen cases going simultaneously, because Swissport isn't the only scheme I'm dealing with. I've got 4 or 5 others. And there I'm acting for the company. So people are constantly sending me emails. Do I need to say this? Here's a document. This is what I want to send out. Is this okay? And sometimes I just have to send it to my juniors and say, please deal, I'm in court. And in the middle of it, my accountant said, oh, by the way, we've forgotten your VAT return is due today. Can you please file it? So because I'm a sole trader, I had to file my own VAT return in the middle of court on Friday. So that was entertaining.
So with COVID at the moment, how do you think it's mainly affected your work and the new ways of having to work? Do you think that will carry on afterwards?
Oh God, I hope not. I mean, I'm probably doing twice as much work as I would normally do, and I work pretty hard. But I'm definitely working twice as hard because I can see what I'm billing. And then all my hearings are remote, so they're all by Skype, which is much more tiring than being there when you're present.
Yes, I think a lot of teachers have found that as well, doing online classes. It's twice the amount of energy.
Yeah, I mean, everyone says, oh, well, you know, at least you don't have to walk down to court. First of all, I quite like walking down to court because it means I get out of my room. But you still have to log on 15 minutes before. And then, you know, the judge is somewhere in the middle of nowhere with crummy Wi-Fi. And so he constantly drops off and then says, sorry, I missed that last 2 minutes of what you said. And you have to keep repeating it. And you have to have a break every hour because everybody's knackered. And I have to do all my administration myself. So when I say I printed off 2,500 pages of documents, normally I would just send my email downstairs to my services people and say, please print this out and put it into files, and then it would appear. But instead, I'm printing it, I'm buying my own toner, I'm replacing my own toner, I'm dealing with my printer jams, which takes a ludicrous amount of time. You know, and I'm having to deal with all that administration stuff, which would normally be someone else.
Why does it need to be printed?
Well, it doesn't always need to be printed. So Friday I used an electronic bundle, and Wednesday I used an electronic bundle. But sometimes it's really difficult to find your way around a bundle. If it's a huge amount of stuff, and what you're trying to do is you're flipping between documents, it's much easier to have them physically in your hands. And my real problem with Monday was those 2,500 pages of documents I had never seen until 8 o'clock in the morning. I knew what somebody told me they said, but I had never seen them at all. So I was preparing with one document in my left hand, another document in my right hand, and 2,500 pages of documents I'd never seen before. And I was trying to get to a point where whatever question the judge asked me, I knew where it was. And if all I had was a screen, I would have no idea. The other thing that is a real pain in hearings is, in a hearing, usually I'm sitting here, my junior is sitting next to me, and they're also supposed to be on top of all the documents. So when the judge says, oh, can you find me the answer to this question? If I don't know the answer, which I usually try to know, I can just say, oh, Mr. So-and-so or Miss So-and-so will tell me the answer to that. And they can then look through their stuff and tell me the answer.
Yeah.
They're now sitting somewhere in their house. So I can still say that, but I have no idea if they're finding it, if they're not finding it. They can't pass me a note saying, here's the answer, or I can pretend I always knew it. You know, so I'm looking at emails with them saying yes, or page 22, by which point I've usually found it myself.
Yeah.
Nor can I turn around when the judge says, oh, well, will your solicitors agree to this? I would normally just look at them, they would nod, I would say yes. Now I have to say, well, I know they're listening in. I'm sure somebody will tell me. And my solicitors are sometimes off doing something else, like everybody else. When they can't be seen on screen, they've gone off to have a nap. They're supposed to be listening. Often they just disappear. And I say repeatedly, I'm sure. And sometimes I'm sending emails saying, please tell me the answer to this question. Please tell me the answer to this question. And it's, you know, in court, generally your solicitors are, you know, physically there and you can see them and they will tell you answers. So for all those reasons, I don't really like remote hearings. I also you can hear my dog barking continuously while we're talking. That's normally my dog doesn't bark when I'm in court, but he's standing in the back garden barking because, you know, why not? So if I were in court, I would have muted this, shut the window and sat here sweltering while my dog was barking, or sent messages, increasingly passive aggressive messages, to the 4 other people in my house saying, please stop the dog barking, I'm in court. And it's nice to have your own space in your own chambers where all your own stuff is, and nobody expects you to do the laundry in the middle of the day. Whereas at the moment I'm doing endless amounts of laundry, and then children appear and say, what's for dinner? You know, they don't usually do that when I'm in chambers. They wait until I come home, or they get their own dinner.
Yes.
So I really do want to, but the judges are making it very clear that there will continue to be remote hearings. Definitely will. Not long ones, but the short ones will continue.
So what's your favourite part of your job?
Oh, I love love being in court. I mean, having said I try not to go to court because it's better for the client, there is something really magical about, you know, the point at which sometimes you go into court, as I did on Monday, and the judge basically said, well, you're obviously right. Now just tell me exactly how you're right. And that's a beautiful hearing where everything you say, the judge is like, yes, and that's another reason why you're right. So you are so right in every way. Or even sometimes you get judges who say, I don't know anything at all about this, but you obviously know everything. Please tell me. And you say this, and the judge says, oh, this is so interesting. I'm so pleased. You know, those are lovely hearings. But actually, the most satisfying hearings are where you go in and the judge says, no, I think you're completely wrong. And you say, well, I'm right for this reason. And he says, well, what about this question? Or she says, what about this question? And you say, well, you know, there's this. And there's a point where you just see the light bulb go on and you think, I did that. My advocacy skills did that. I found just the right way to persuade you. And that's the best bit about the job. I mean, it's great solving people's problems. You know, it's one of the things about the area of law I do is that it's all written in language which makes no sense. You know, so somebody will come to you and say, oh, we want to have a scheme to use a PIC toggle on the MES creditors. And you think, I don't know what any of those words mean. And you, of course, say, yes, PIC toggle set. We should definitely PIC toggle. Temporary PIC toggle or a permanent PIC toggle? And then you read the papers and you think, oh, a PIC toggle just means that they're not getting paid interest in cash. Okay, I know what a PIC toggle is then. And so now you know all this new language, which is great. I mean, that is, you know, that is great to feel on top of that. And then, so you get a question which makes no sense to you at all, and then it's suddenly solved, which is lovely. You know, that's good.
So I'm wondering, is there a project that you're working on at the moment that's interesting, but a bit different that you're allowed to mention?
I'm trying to think because they're almost all. So here's one that is coming up for a hearing. This is not well, it's like all things I do, it's a bit insolvency, but not completely straight insolvency. So this is a case where there is a Spanish insolvency. So it's a huge insolvency going on in Spain because a lot of stuff I do is international. So there's a huge insolvency going on in Spain, and we're English people and we'd like to be paid a lot of money. Thank you very much. And so we issue proceedings here and we say, English court, please order these people to pay us lots of money here. And the people on the other side say, oh no, because it's all going on in Spain, the English court shouldn't determine it at all. We should all go off to Spain. And the reason why, and anyhow, everything you say about what we did and how we got the money is all wrong. And you sort of look at a case like that and you think, oh, that sounds quite convincing, actually. It does sound like it should probably all go on in Spain. So you go to a Spanish professor and say, what's the answer to this? And the Spanish professor says, well, actually, the answer is it's got nothing to do with what happened in Spain. Everything they say about Spanish law is completely wrong. In fact, Spanish law is all this. And so the result of all of that is you're right to say it should happen in England. The reason why that sort of case is so interesting is because it's not just about learning new facts about, you know, what's happening in this company and how do things work, but you learn a huge amount about Spanish law. And you are being told it by a professor of Spanish law. So this is about the most knowledgeable person you could ever ask to tell you the answer. So if you imagine, you know, any question that you have about any subject, you suddenly have the world-renowned expert, sometimes both of them. So the guy on the other side is also pretty knowledgeable. And you get these two peoples telling you everything that you could ever want to know about this subject. That's a pretty interesting thing. It's not dinner party conversation. I mean, you know, if you want to have something which is interesting to people about the facts, you'll go into crime, but you'll never make any money. but you'll be able to, you'll have much more interesting stories.
Mm.
But intellectually, you know, this stuff is really just really, really interesting stuff. It's like, you know, being really interested in English and you saying, oh, you know, I wonder why Hamlet said this. And someone saying, oh, well, here are the two foremost Shakespearean professors in the universe. They can tell you what they think about the answer, and you can then think about it with them. And by the way, you can then go in front of a judge who also happens to be one of the foremost Shakespearean scholars in the world, and then you can have a chat about them and try and work it out. That's what's really interesting about high quality commercial law.
So what are the important skills you need to do your role? I know obviously being able to present an argument, but what other skills? I assume listening as well.
Yeah, I mean, the most obvious skills that lawyers need are being able to read a lot of documents very, very quickly, to be able to summarize them very quickly, to use your advocacy skills in order to present them. Those are the kind of the obvious ones. The less obvious skills are reading body language. So if you're in front of a judge and the judge is bored by what you're saying, then he's not listening to you. Or, you know, if she's sitting there thinking about something else, everything you've said, you know, she's still thinking about the point you just made, and you're barreling into the next point, and she's not listening. She won't have heard a word of it. And so, or you say something which you think is a really brilliant point, and the judge is just, you know, there's just little imperceptible eyebrow raising, and you think, oh, that one didn't go down so well. Or you just need to put it slightly differently. The judge is looking slightly confused. Well, that, you know, judge didn't quite get that. Let me put it this way or put it this way. Or use an example, like a practical example of how it might work. So you're watching for the light bulb moments. So those are body language reading, very good. Also, something quite a lot of barristers are bad at is people skills. So people management. So asking people to do something by a particular time and being quite precise about what it is. Or if somebody has spent a very long time doing something, a lot of barristers will just say, well, that's rubbish, or that seems irrelevant, or I think you've completely misunderstood the question. Those sorts of barristers tend to get less work unless they're really brilliant, because clients don't like being told they're wrong all the time. So but also, as you say, listening. I mean, you would think that was obvious, but a lot of barristers are rubbish at that. I mean, when you sit there in court and the judge will say, oh, Miss So-and-so, you know, how about this? And they'll just answer a completely different point. And you'll think, did you not hear the question the judge just asked you? The judge asked you a question because she wants to know the answer to it. You should probably give the answer to it. And they just don't. They've got some prepared script. They just, you know, yeah, I'll come back to that point later. You're like, no, judge asked you, answer it now. So those sorts of things are really kind of important.
So what advice would you give a young person who wanted to go into a career in law, whether it be barrister or solicitor? What sort of advice?
I would say do not go into law for the money. There are many areas of law in which you will be paid a very large amount of money. But if you don't enjoy it, the sort of hours that you will have to work will be absolutely miserable for you. I mean, I can think of so many people who went into corporate law, found that they hated it and just got stuck in it because of the money. Absolutely, really detested going to work every day. So you need to find something that you are passionate about. And if it happens to pay well, that's great. But be prepared, particularly as a barrister, not luckily doing the sort of work I do, which is very highly paid, particularly once you've been doing it for 25 years, as I have been. But doing a lot of other sorts of law where you're self-employed and sometimes you don't get paid anything because you haven't worked all week. You know, don't just do it because of the money, and don't assume that you will be paid a lot of money because in other areas of the law you aren't. But I would say, if you are curious, if you like solving problems, if you love to learn new things, those are the sorts of things that will make you love law. That will mean that you don't mind working all the hours that you have to work to do the sort of work I do. Or do a different sort of law where you don't have to work these hours. I mean, there's no reason why all lawyers have to do the sort of work I do. In fact, almost no lawyers do the sort of work I do. It's very specialist. It's a very, very hyper specialist field. But I just, you know, if you are interested in the power of language, both using it, what words mean, if you look at words and think, well, what does that mean? Why do they use that? If you like crafting persuasive arguments, then you're probably a lawyer. And if you're always looking for a loophole, so if your parents or your carers are constantly setting down rules and you're constantly finding ways to get around it, you're probably a lawyer.
Good tip. Good tip.
Well, I tell you, my 16-year-old is an absolutely natural lawyer. I mean, he is just constantly looking for, you didn't say that with these words. You said this, therefore you must have meant this. So I'm frightened that definitely my 16-year-old is a lawyer. My 18-year-old, definitely a philosopher.
Which takes me nicely onto this. But so if you weren't a lawyer, what career would you be doing now?
I would have certainly have been an academic. I would have been a university lecturer. I mean, it was very close for me. I was asked to take the exam for a fellowship at All Souls in Oxford, and I did teach at Oxford for a while. And then I thought, I'll see if anything works at the bar. I'll see if I'm successful. And as it happened, I was. Now I have gone back to teaching, so I'm a visiting professor at Oxford. And in fact, in September this year, I will start doing a part-time PhD in my spare time, which I'm hoping I might have some of one of these days. Yeah, I would have been a university professor.
Cool. So my final question to you, is there any part of your career that holds a myth or a stereotype that you would like to dispel?
Not all barristers are posh white people who went to Oxford. A lot of barristers are posh white people who went to Oxford, but not by no means all. And the people who are trailblazers in our profession are the people who've come from different backgrounds. And you should also not assume that people like me, who did go to a private school and then on to Oxford, come from the same sort of background. You know, I went to private school because I went on scholarship. I did not. All my clothes came from charity shops. We bought the food we bought on the local markets. When I left university, I had scholarships, and that was how I afforded to live. And I lived in basically a squat in Leighton while I was at bar school with 4 other people with mould growing up my wall, which I paid 40 quid a week for. So don't just assume that when you see somebody, you know what their background is, because not everybody's like that. There are a lot of posh white people at the bar. But these days they're becoming more out of touch, really. So if you come from a different background, don't be put off by what you think the bar is like. Brilliant.
Well, Felicity, thank you ever so much. I really enjoyed that.
Now everybody's going to want to become an insolvency lawyer because it's awesome.
Maybe.
I'm sure that's how it's going to work.